Hans Selye built upon Cannon's research and he developed the general adaptation syndrome theory. And within this theory of stress, he sought to describe how we respond both on a short term as well as a long term basis to stress. This model has three phases. The first phase is the alarm reaction. The alarm reaction includes our immediate reaction to a stressor. In this initial phase, we display that flight or fight response that Cannon described, and this prepares the body for our physical activity that we are going to do in response to the stressor. This initial response can decrease the effectiveness of the immune system. As a result, humans are more susceptible to illness during this phase. And it's important to keep in mind that when you think about flight or fight, and you think about our ancient ancestors, they were exposed to stressors that put them at more risk for physical harm. That's not the same for us today, thankfully, because of how civilization has evolved and because of the lifestyles that many of us live. Some of those same threats to our physical safety that might have existed for our ancient ancestors do not exist for us quite in the same way. Nonetheless, our body still experiences all of those changes that take place when faced with a stressor to prepare us to react appropriately to that stressor. So you can begin to see how, if this stress response within the body is activated far too often, or it remains activated over long periods of time because of how we are responding to the stressor, both physically and mentally, that this could have some negative impacts on our overall health. So, the second phase is the stage of resistance or adaptation. So, Selye proposes that if the stress continues, the person at this point adapts to the stressor to which they have been exposed. There are changes that would happen at a number of levels to reduce the impact of that stressor on the person. So, if you remember when we talked about chronic stress, and I mentioned that it's just becomes sort of in the background and it becomes just part of someone's day to day routine. What Selye is saying is that this is, in a way, an adaptation to that type of a stressor, and a way of perhaps trying to cope with it is that you just adapt and you make some changes to reduce how that stressor is impact you and how that stressor is impacting you, and you just adapt to say, okay, this is part of my life. I have to continue to move forward. So the third stage is the stage of exhaustion. This is when he proposes that the stressor has continued for a long time. The initial resistance to the stress from phase two may either gradually reduce or quickly collapse. The immune system is heavily impacted, and the body's ability to fight diseases may be gone. Someone with a stressful job, let's say, for example, over time, may develop high blood pressure and as a result later have a heart attack. Because at this stage of exhaustion, that initial resistance that you put up, the ways that you initially adapted, just are no longer effective. Those coping strategies weren't an effective way to cope and adequately deal with whatever that stressor was in your life. So he also proposes that Someone's response to stress is also impacted by several social and biological factors, such as someone's genetic makeup, their social class, their sex or gender, and their age. So, next we move on to Lazarus. Lazarus developed the transactional model of stress. And within this model, he proposes that stressful events are thought of as person to environment transactions. And the type of transaction that takes place depends on the impact of the external stressor on the person. And our personal appraisals, the way that we perceive this stressor, and the cultural as well as social resources available to us to help to cope with the impact of the stressor has an effect on how we respond to the transaction within our environment. So, when we're faced with the stressor, according to Lazarus, we evaluate the potential threats of that stressor. And it's that appraisal, that initial appraisal of the stressor, determines whether we react to the stressor or not. So, we make a decision about whether the event is irrelevant. Is it controllable? Is it something that's positive? Is it challenging? Okay. And then this helps us to figure out, do we respond positively? Do we respond negatively? It helps us to determine what do we do next. So you can see how Lazarus's theory is taking in more than the other two theories into account that as humans we have this higher order thinking that we're capable of. So it's not just a physical reaction. Yes, that physical reaction is very important, and it's very important to us today, and it was very important to our ancient ancestors. But we're more than just that physical response, that we do take that time to quickly think things through. So Lazarus also proposes that there is a reappraisal that takes place after our initial appraisal, and this refers to our assessment of our ability to control as well as cope with this stressor. So, if we feel as if we're unable to cope, we may remain aroused longer than those who are able to adapt to these experiences more quickly. So, as I mentioned, for the first time, this theory, a theory of stress, recognized that there are some psychological factors that need to be considered. And as a result, it allowed for the possibility that individuals may have a variety of different responses to the same stressful event, which you can see happening. So, for example, there have been stressful events with hurricanes or earthquakes or a fire happening in someone's home. And you can see how each individual will experience that differently. Yes, there's a level of stress associated with it, but everyone's mindset is a little bit different. You could have children who grow up in the same household. Perhaps there was a parent who was mentally ill, or a parent who was addicted to a substance, or perhaps there was some sort of abuse going on in the home. And you'll see how children's responses are different. How they experience that stressor looks different for each child. Now we continue to move forward to the last theory that we are touching on. And as I mentioned, there are other theories that are out there, but these were the ones that we touched on for this class. So, McEwen developed the concept of allostasis. And this is the process of being able to achieve some sort of adaptation, and you heard that word before, right? Or stability through both behavioral and or physiological changes when we are exposed to a stressor. It's important to adapt to these changes that are happening to us in our environment when that stressor is in front of us. Hormones within our body, such as cortisol and adrenaline, are important in trying to help us to maintain a balance when we're faced with stressful situations. Although these hormones are necessary in the short run, in the long run, they cost us. And that cost is referred to as the allostatic load. So, to give a little bit more information, within the concept of the allostatic load, it proposes that there are physiological costs of chronic exposure to the heightened neural responses that are the result of repeated stress. When the body's stress response is activated, frequently it can damage the body in the long run because that stress response is intended to handle acute short term threats. If you remember earlier in the presentation, we talked about acute stress, episodic acute stress, chronic stressors, as well as traumatic stressors. So, when you are exposed to chronic stressors and even episodic acute stress, and sometimes when you are exposed to a traumatic stressor, even though it might be a one time event, the large impact of that can affect you on a day to day basis for some time within some people. You could see how the body remains in this heightened state for far too long, and that can have negative consequences. Essentially, according to this model, there is wear and tear on the body as a result of chronic stress or poor recovery. The demand is too great, and our coping skills just are not strong enough. As a result, there could be several organs within our bodies and tissues that may experience strain, such as our cardiovascular system. Now we're going to move on to talk about stress and its effect on our bodies. And I want you to take a think break and to think through um, this question. Genetics has a strong influence on how we respond to stress physiologically and psychologically. Take a few minutes to think about your family history. What psychological and physical ailments may you be predisposed to based on your genes? Does the stress in your life impact your risk? So you could go ahead and pause the presentation and think through that question. So on this slide, you see a picture of the human body, and it talks about the impact of stress on many different parts of our body. It talks about the brain, the mouth, the lungs, our reproductive organs, our digestive tract, our muscles, our hair. Okay? And at the top, it reads physical or mental stressors may cause physical illness as well as mental or emotional problems. Okay, so I'm not going to read through all of this, but you could go ahead and pause the presentation right now and just read through each of the body systems and the way that stress could impact our bodies if we allow it to.